Well, I'd say good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming for today's talk. It's all about the cuts of Gloucestershire, the canals of Gloucestershire, and we'll dive straight in. So we know people have been using Gloucestershire's waterways for thousands of years. It's the easiest and cheapest way of moving commodities, especially bulk ones, around the county. But by the 1750s, there was a growing national demand for a way of transporting goods and foodstuffs by water to places away from rivers, and the canals were born. Then, when people realised that good money may be made from canals, we got this lovely thing called canal mania took off. We had 8 canals built in Gloucestershire. The earliest opened in 1779, the last in 1827. And today, almost 200 years later, only one, the GNS, which is the Gloucester and Sharpness Canal. Throughout this talk, I've often condensed the names of the canals because they just take up too much space. So only one is fully navigable over its original length, but there's a welcome renaissance of canals going on at the moment, and with 4 others, so the Stridewater Canal, the Thames and Severn, the Lydney Canal and the Hereford and Gloucestershire Canal are all in the process of restoration, and one, the Coombe Hill Canal, is acting as a nature reserve. So they are still in use, and they are still, fantastic places. So just a quick back about the very early history of the canal. So the first modern canal of the age was the Sankey Brook Navigation, which is later known as St Helens Canal, opened in 1757, and it basically was built to carry coal from Haydock collieries and par to Liverpool, essentially. It was followed 4 years later in 1761 by the more famous Bridgewater Canal, which initially connected Worsley to Manchester. There's a lovely picture of one of the boats on it there. Both these canals were great successes, and they proved that canals were much quicker, could carry huge volumes of cargo, and were much safer for fragile items than were the roads at the time. So more importantly as well, they made quite a lot of money, and say this triggered off the age of canal mania. So most of Britain's canals were built between 1790 excuse me, and 1810. And were financed by merchants, aristocrats and bankers. Essentially, all these people who had disposable incomes and looking to invest their capital for fat profits. But canals are also funded by coal mine owners, textile manufacturers and pottery barons who wanted cheaper and faster transport of their community, so basically they could make more money. Almost anyone who was anyone wanted to get involved in building or investing in a canal scheme, and a frenzy of canal building erupted. And this is a lovely Crookshank cartoon here showing a bunch of investors sort of poring over plans for a potential canal somewhere. Rather great drawing. So between 1791 and 1795, it's the height of the canal mania, over 44 canal acts were passed in the United Kingdom, and while some were well founded and workable, others were less so. As time passed, investors found that rising construction costs, partly caused by economic conditions resulting from the Napoleonic Wars, and also gradual competition from the newfangled railways which were starting to appear, these caused financial obstacles that could only be overcome at great expense. So interest in canals did begin to wane a little bit. Eventually, there's over 4,000 miles of canals were built, but in reality, sadly, only a few ever gave a good return for their investors. Some, such as the Herefordshire and Gloucestershire Canal, never paid a dividend to the shareholders, while others, such as the Grand Western Canal, which was meant to link the Bristol Channel to the English Channel, bypassing Land's End and making it much faster for ships to sail around, they were simply abandoned, partly built. And this map here just shows a few of the canals. There are a few more on there, but it gives you an idea of the extent of them. So look at how canals were built, basically. So before any work commenced, potential routes would be surveyed. The ideal theme was to try and create a route that required as little engineering infrastructure, so few locks, viaducts, tunnels, etc. as possible. This made it a lot cheaper, obviously, and it was much more profitable in the end. So the early canals, especially, would often meander through the countryside as they followed land contours. However, later canals often took more direct routes, and they used the classic cut and fill technique. So you use material from cuttings to build embankments. Therefore, you can make your canal go a lot more in a straight line, making it easier and faster. So after a survey had been done, you'd normally get an Act of Parliament would be obtained, after which authorised funds could be raised, usually via shareholders. The canal company would then appoint a chief engineer. He would also have an engineering plan drawn up. This always had to be deposited with the local quarter sessions. So here in Gloucestershire Archives, we have quite a few canal plans, many of which would never came off, but some of which did. Then after this, necessary land will be purchased. Often you might have to have minor deviations if landowners refuse to sell. Not always, but some. In terms of actual construction, the first stage was pegging out, so basically marking where the canal's going to go, starting in one end or the middle and working either way, after which topsoil would be removed and then the cutting, hence the cuts of the canals or digging, would commence. The canal companies usually could either commission work out to contractors, or they often hired direct labour, usually local labourers and farmhands. The contractors usually employed migratory gangs of workers who became known as navigators, or the navvies, because they dug the navigations as the canals were known. Contrary to popular belief, most navvies were English. They did frequently take their families with them, and they often lived in crowded tented camps or temporary huts near to the canal, sometimes in one place, sometimes they would move along. The early navvies, has to be said, were not as feared by local communities as the later railway workers were, primarily because there were fewer of them and fewer places they were working. Today, interestingly, there's only one set of surviving navvy housings known, and these are wooden huts at Edmundthorpe and Wynandon Railway Station in Leicester. And these wooden huts are now protected Grade 2 as listed buildings. However, we think the tiny hamlet of Newtown near Stonehouse may also be navvy housing. Here, the buildings all face the canal and not the road, which you'd think they would do if they were sort of normal houses. They all have similar features and all similar construction materials, suggesting they're all built at the same time. And it seems possible that the site was built by the Stroudwater Canal Company, and there are 3 larger houses there. They would have been built for the senior staff and craftsmen, while the smaller houses were probably built for senior navvies, the guys in charge of groups of the navvies. But these houses also have very long gardens, which would have been very, very suitable for crowding in temporary or tented hutting there. So we think this could possibly be a remnant of a navvy settlement. Another little clue is that this little tiny hamlet, just 10 houses, once supported 3 pubs. So that's a lot of drinking going on by somebody somewhere. So canals were usually built to a shallow U or V shape with gently sloping sides, and this is a typical cross-section of one. The canal bed and sides were made watertight by a process either of lining or by puddling. Now, puddling involved making a thick clay mix of loam, clay and coarse sand, which was then actually physically worked in and trodden into the canal bed and sides. And this magnificent photograph, I love this photograph, shows repairs being undertaken on the Thames and Severn Canal at Blue House Reach, and clearly you can see the puddling layer there with the soil on top. Notice that the canal's been drained, although this was always a leaky canal at this top section. And also notice that on the right hand side there's a little narrow gauge railway being brought in to bring materials in, presumably. Once they'd done the puddling layer, they'd often then put a layer of soil on top, and then you can see this where the linemen are working. They're working on the actual puddling layer, and then you can see the soil above it there. So some of the features of canals, the most obvious one are locks. Locks are used for basically raising and lowering boats between stretches of water of different levels. Obviously, a canal can't have an incline; it's got to be relatively flat. So this is what enabled canals to climb and descend hills, basically. There are several types of lock, but in Gloucestershire, most of ours are pound locks, so called because they have a pound of water at each end, a pound pond, basically, and an internal lock chamber that can be filled or emptied with water. Lock gates made of timber, oak or elm, mostly oak today, and their ends are mitred so that when they close you get a good watertight seal. The gates are opened by the arms there, which are also called balance beams, and when the water level is on the correct level for the gate, they open actually very, very easily, despite the fact they can weigh quite a few tons. So water enters or leaves the lock via gate paddles, usually on the bottom lock here, or ground paddles on the top lock. The ground paddles let water in underneath the gates, basically, on the side of the gates, and this stops boats being flooded with lots of water pouring in. And if you haven't seen a lock operate, it's well worth trying to find one that is. Some of the Birmingham navigations, the locks are in use quite a lot, and it's quite fun to watch it work. This is a little lovely lock at Blunder Lock. It's built in 1778, and it's one of these things that shows you locks didn't always go according to plan. Blunder Lock is actually the fourth in a flight of 5 locks that carries the Stroudwater Canal up past the village of Eastington. You hardly notice it's a climb, but it is. So they had to build 5 locks to get the canal through there. And on this flight, the positioning of the locks and the choice of levels they wanted had to take account not only the natural topography of the land, but also crossing a farm track, a stream, and an important road. So Blunderlock was so called because the engineer, Thomas Fruin, he was in charge of building the canal, made an error when setting out its level. So he got the level wrong, basically. And the result was that the second and third locks in the flight, which was Docklock and Pikelock, had to be deeper than planned, while the fourth and fifth locks, which is Blunderlock and New Tyne Lock and above it, were much shallower. So hence, when people realised this, they started calling it the Blunderlock because he'd made a blunder in his calculations. The mistake wasn't just embarrassing to the canal company, but it did actually cause subsequent water management problems. All these things had to be gauged. How much water did the lock use? And don't forget, every time a lock was filled and emptied, that's a lot of water going down the lock. So you had to be replaced from above the lock. So these water management things were quite important. Looking at bridges, so many types of bridge evolved for use on the canals. Most used local stone or bricks made with locally sourced material to cut down on costs. And in Gloucestershire, we've got 3 main types of bridge. So we've got the road bridge. This is an example. This is Pike Bridge at Eastington. Sadly, this has now been rebuilt as a much less attractive concrete bridge. But you basically see what it does. It's a good, robust bridge that carries a road of some sort across it. Then you get the roving bridges, and these are lovely little things. They're usually humpback, and they were built primarily to carry the towpath over the canal. This is Newtown Bridge at Stonehouse, which is a lovely little bridge. There is actually a little road goes over it, but most of it was built just to carry the towpath, and they're quite steep and definitely humpbacked. You then also get swing bridges, and this is a swing bridge here on the Gloucester on the Gloucestershire Sharpness. Elsewhere in the county, they tend to be on the Thames and Severn. Siddington is an example. And the ones on the Thames and Severn were quite small, single-span types, usually carrying a farm track over the canal, and they can be opened and easily closed. The ones on the Gloucester Sharpness, which is technically a ship canal rather than a sort of normal canal, so it's much wider, they were usually comprised of 2 half wooden spans, which could be swung to let vessels pass. However, as time passed, they've now been replaced by single-span steel bridges. And again, if you go down to the Gloucester Sharpness Canal at one of the bridges, you'll often see them swinging open. And again, it's quite nice to watch. Look at aqueducts. These were carrying sort of the canal over things. A few small ones existed in the county, mostly on the Herefordshire and Gloucestershire Canal, and also on the Thames and Severn. This is the Smerrill Aqueduct on the Thames and Severn. It comprised a single stone-built arch, carried the canal over the Kemble to Cirencester Road. This is the only known photograph that survives, and today very little remains there. You wouldn't know there is ever a sort of canal aqueduct bridge there at all. We do have a nice one though. The sole water-filled survivor aqueduct is the Elbrook Aqueduct on the Hereford and Gloucestershire Canal. It's just north of Newark, and it carries the canal over the Elbrook. It's restored by volunteers in 2009 and consists of a stone-built single-arch aqueduct, so very similar to the Smerrill one. We don't have any of the massive aqueducts that you find in the rest of the country, I should say. But we have other features as well. So the lengthsmen were canal employees responsible for set lengths of the canal, and their duties included management of the towpath, the locks, lock keeping, bridge and bridge keeping, management and monitoring of water levels, plus repair and maintenance of banks on their length. And this included cutting reeds and vegetation. If you remember, there's sort of the 1980s BBC programme The River. The main character there was a lengthsman, basically. So they usually lived in company-built, sometimes isolated stone or brick cottages, usually placed close to their main responsibility. This cottage on the left here is the lockkeeper's cottage at Pike Lock on the Stroudwater, and the bridgekeeper's cottage here at Chestnut Lane Bridge, also on the Stroudwater. So they lived quite close. They didn't always have to live that close. Sometimes they lived a little further away, which we'll see in a second here. So the Thames and Severn's lengthsmen's cottages were unusual. Instead of being rectangular houses, they were circular stone roundhouses. They usually had a basement stable and a store, living accommodation on two of the next floors, and then a roof cistern for collecting rainwater. And they were ingenious little things. 5 were built, but sadly they proved quite cramped and unpracticable for day-to-day living. And we know at 2 of them, those Cerney Wick and Marston Maisie, were superseded by more standard rectangular cottages. But there are a couple of the circular ones still surviving to this day. On the Gloucestershire Sharpness Ship Canal, it was a grander, bigger canal, so as befitted that, the actual canal company went for a more impressive sort of cottage, and it was a classically inspired look there, and you can see it there, it looks really nice. There are 16 road bridges crossing the canal. 8 of these sites have these classical style houses. The others may do with pre-existing nearby dwellings. Sadly, relatively little is known about the original designer of these, as there are several possibilities. But they all have a Greek cross plan, with one arm being a front porch with a pediment supported by 2 Doric columns, and they look really elegant, really nice. But quite ingeniously, although when you view them from the canal they look like single-storey buildings, 4 of them have actually lower floors built into the rear slope of the canal bank, and you can see that in this bottom picture here, where you can see it goes down below the canal, which is, I think, is wonderfully ingenious. So when working boats were charged tolls to use the canals, and this is how the canals made their money, most erected mileposts to help boatmen and the canal companies calculate how far boats had travelled, as the distances they travelled formed the basis of toll charges. Usually the type and weight of a cargo, which is typically fixed rate per ton mile, basically. And there are mileposts on the Gloucester and Sharpness Canal and the Thames and Severn Canal seen here. And while some companies use attractive cast iron designs, like in the Thames and Severn at the bottom here, which has got the name of the way you go, in Walsbriggs there, it's 28 miles, Inglesham, half a mile. Other companies simply went for cheaper stone markers because they were much easier, cost a lot less. Interestingly, the Stroudwater Canal never actually had them, so we're not quite sure why this was. But what they did have was they had boundary markers. At the end of Blunderlock, we've looked at that earlier, there are 2 boundary stones, each inscribed SWN for Stroudwater Navigation, marking land owned by the company. And this was needed to work the lock. But the markers were needed because the company actually did not own any land elsewhere on the south side of the canal. So it needed these markers just to remind people that actually we own this bit, keep off, basically. So that's a bit about the introduction of the canals. We'll now look at the individual histories of the canals we have. Obviously, this is hugely compressed, basically. But essentially, I've done at the start what I've put the first act just for you. I won't read these out because it's just there for you to look at. So the Stroudwater Canal, first canal in the county, arguably, but it faced opposition from millers who feared it would take too much water from the River Frome, and so the original plan stalled. And from then onwards, several schemes were proposed, including one without locks that would use cranes to lift cargoes over mill weirs, very impractical, really. But all these plans came to nothing until 1776, when the millers' resistance was finally overcome. And with a new fresh act and new capital, construction began in earnest. So it ran from Framalode on the Severn to Walbridge Basin in Stroud. It opened in 1779 at a cost of £40,930. Traffic was high, and at least I had 16,000 tonnes per year, which allowed the company to repay debts and make a dividend of 5% in 1786 after just 7 years of opening, which is fascinating, a great return. This is an interesting map showing the canal. Of course, from our eyes today, this is upside down because north is at the bottom, or sort of the bottom right, basically. So it's a bit strange looking at it, but it is that gives you the idea. The Severn there on the right, and this Walbridge Basin in Stroud on the left-hand side there. So the actual canal was built to accommodate 7 trows, and these were sort of the larger ships that could bring goods up and down the Severn, from Bristol, from the Forest Dean, and from the Midlands, and this allowed the canal allowed them to get into Stroud itself, so cut out a lot of difficult travelling on roads and made it a lot cheaper. The navigation was also determined as a commercial waterway, and pleasure boats were discouraged by imposing a quite a hefty charge of £1, which is about 132 quid today, for the use of each lock. So you imagine if you're going up the Eastington flight at 5 locks, it's £5. That's over £500 today. So it's not viable for small pleasure boats to use it. Interestingly, there was no towpath for horses until quite late in 27. So prior to this, though sort of some craft were sailed along the canal, if the wind was right, you could sail along it quite easily. Most were actually bow-hauled by men. And this print, a lovely print, it actually depicts the visit of King George III in his ceremonial barge when the canal was opened. Shows St Sire's Church at Stonehouse, and you can see there 3 men bow-hauling a barge here. Interestingly, the tow rope there wasn't connected to the bow, it was connected to the mast. Most of them were towed from the mast. But this was after the towpath was built. So there were 12 locks along the Stroud Water. This is the Pike Lock at Eastington, but the company also put great efforts into making facilities to attract users to the canal. Several wharfs were created on the canal side to load and unload cargoes. This is Bristol Road Wharf at Whitminster, and the company also built a dry dock at Docklock, which is below Eastington, to repair boats. And this is a fascinating setup, which sadly we don't know very much about. This is about the only known photo of it. It would have been fascinating to find real plans of this building, which we hope to in the archive one day. One interesting post-build feature was the ocean near Stonehouse, and this was a large pool that was originally formed when a stream was blocked during the building of the Bristol and Gloucester Railway embankment, and the canal company subsequently built a small dock with a chute from the railway, which was subsequently used to unload canal barges, bringing in ballast and building material for the construction of the railway. So it's very ironic that the railways, which would later take all the canal trade, relied on the canals very often to build them initially. So later the railway company added a siding there, and they also made it so that freight could be unloaded from the railway wagons onto canal barges, so a reverse of fortunes there. And later a warehouse, you can see it here on the right hand side, was built over the dock to protect goods in transit. And this is a lovely picture of a canal working its way down to the Sewell Junction. On the background you can see there's a train going by, but it's difficult to tell, but there's also some wagons in the actual siding there, so we know it was used quite well. So although most of the traffic on the Stroud Water was eastbound, not all of it was. And this is a fascinating photo of the Trowerine in the family based in the canal, waiting to lock out onto the Severn. And she was bound for the Bullowpill dock in the Forest, basically with a cargo of hay for the pit ponies of the Forest of Dean, essentially. What's interesting is she had no sails or engine, so she was basically locked out into the Severn on the ebb tide and returned on the flood tide. And she was steered by essentially lowering a lump of pig iron on a chain that dragged along the riverbed to retard her process, so she was allowed to be steered that way. And of course, on the flood tide, the reverse would happen. So a fascinating way of working a boat with no engine and no sails, and a crew of 2 or 3 basically. So the Stroud Water Navigation Company left behind a massive archive, includes letters, minute books, tonnage books, and much more. It's a fascinating archive, and I can't recommend this website enough. Excellent website, the Stroud Water Navigation Archive charity. It's a great website. Lots of pictures, lots of background history. Thoroughly recommend it. Please do go and visit it. So following the opening of the Thames and Severn Canal in 1789, the Stroud Water formed part of the first through route from Bristol to London, although later much of its trade switched to the more direct Kennet and Avon Canal after that opening in 1810. And as time passed, commercial traffic began to dwindle, leisure traffic began to increase. And this is a lovely couple of photos of an outing on the Stroudwater Canal around 1910. So there's a barge coming down the canal laden with people. We don't know anything about them really, possibly a church outing I suspect, but note the horse on the ahead of the barge. And then in the second photo, it's actually up along the side and people have got off. This was taken at the Bristol Road wharf that you saw earlier, but note now, look how overgrown the actual wharf is. And despite competition from the Kennet and Avon and the railways, the Stroudwater Canal continued to pay dividends to shareholders until 1922, and it was not finally abandoned until 1954. Moving on to the Thames and Severn, that's one of the acts for it. So work started on this canal in 1783. It opened in 1789. It ran for 29 miles, connected the navigable Thames at Inglesham Lock near Lechlade to the Stroudwater at Walbridge Stride, and thence to the River Severn. There was one short branch arm from Sydenham to Cirencester. We'll see that later. And later on, a link was made to the North Wilts Canal, to basically join the Wiltshire-Berkshire Canal. So lots of these canals later on joined up, although sometimes they were jealous about the water conditions in each one. And that's just to give you a rough idea of the through route from Framelode there. So the Thames and Severn begins in Stroud, it's the lighter blue, and then goes all the way through Kemble, past Cirencester, past Cricklade to Lechlade. So whereas the Stroudwater utilised the Frome Valley, the Thames and Severn Canal had to endure a quite steep climb up the Cotswold Escarpment, then a long summit level followed by a gradual descent into the River Thames. As a result, it needed 44 locks, and the canal's water supply was always an issue. So water for the canal was taken from the River Frome on the west side and from the River Churn on the east side, mainly on Sundays when the mills were not working and the mills wanted the water. No reservoirs were built, and so problems with porous limestone, and this caused frequent leaks as springs would often burst through the limestone and the puddle in there. And I make no apologies for showing this picture of Blue House Reach again, because I just like it so much. But one of the troubles was, because of this porous limestone, lots of repairs had to be undertaken, and water supply was always an issue. The Thames and Severn featured some quite major engineering works along its length, including the Sapperton Tunnel, Brimscombe Port and Basin, the Daneway Basin and the Thames Head Pumping Station. So we'll have a quick look at these all in turn. So the Sapperton Tunnel, very famous. Easily the biggest engineering challenge of the canal, for it carried the canal through the Cotswold Escarpment, starting at Sapperton, ending at Coates. You can see it on the Ordnance Survey maps here. Construction began in 1784. Charles Jones was the initial contractor, although he was later replaced for many reasons, but including his love of the bottle, has to be said. It was 15 feet high and wide, 230 feet below ground at its deepest point, and literally 3,817 yards long. It was the longest tunnel of any kind in England for 22 years, until it was surpassed in 1811 by the Huddersfield Narrow Canal's Standedge Tunnel. The actual Sapperton Tunnel took 4 years to complete. There are 26 vertical shafts dug along the tunnel and allowed simultaneous working, and the deepest of these was at 244 feet down. So again, quite deep working going on here. And a mix of manual labour and explosives were used to excavate the rock, and a small railway was actually built to take workers into the tunnel and remove waste materials before it was put into water. So the geology of the tunnel involved passing through the Great Oolite, which is solid limestone, the Inferior Oolite, which is friable porous limestone, and also Fuller's Earth clay, which is essentially unrefined cat litter. And all this combination of these three types of sort of geology caused many construction issues. The Oolite rock especially had water permeable fissures, which caused rock falls and allowed the formation of springs in wet times, and dry periods, the deeper ones often broke through the tunnel, causing water leakage. In areas where the tunnel went through, Fuller's Earth clay had to be lined with expensive brick, and after the tunnel opened in 1789, it did require quite frequent maintenance. And these are great pictures here. You can see from the Cotswold Canal and Pictures website, well worth looking at, gives you an idea of sort of what the conditions were like there. So 2 stone portals were built at either end of the tunnel. They're both been now restored by the Cotswold Canals Trust, magnificent organisation. And the tunnel opened in April 1789, I'd say 5 years of construction. Too narrow for any kind of towpath, so boats pass through either using poles or by legging. And a typical transport took about 3.5 hours. So legging was where boats were moved by men walking along the side of the tunnel. We know the leggers were paid about 5 shillings for a loaded boat and half that amount for an empty one. And there's a picture of a couple of guys how it was done. So it must have been quite arduous and, you know, somewhat strange work, I think. So Brimscombe Port, this was headquarters of the Thames and Severn. It consisted of a large basin with wharfage, a barge weighbridge, warehousing and a shipyard. It permitted the easy transshipment of goods from Trows coming up from Stroud and put into barges, which then Thames barges, which carried the goods eastwards towards London. Main basin was 700 feet long, so quite a size, but sadly after the closure of the canal it was sadly infilled, and it's a shame. It would have been great to have that there for us today. Here's a couple of pictures of various views of it. You can see the expanse of water. There's an early drawing of it on the bottom right there before really much had been built. I will mention the weighbridge there because this is quite an important feature, and it was just one of 4 weighbridges in the country. The others were at Newport, Cardiff and Midford on the Somerset Coal Canal, so it was quite a rare thing, and it's such a shame it didn't survive. It was located on the north side of the basin in an open-sided building, see the photo here, and it was used to accurately find the weight of the boat so that the gauging system used to determine the weight of the cargo could be found. Basically, it meant the canal company didn't lose any money for boats that were overloaded and only reported certain tonnages. It had lock gates and used a system of levers so the comparatively small weights could be used to measure the boat weight. So basically the client didn't have to lug 1-ton weights on and off scales. I mean, I know weighbridges exist and I did do them when I was doing physics at school, but I still think they're magic, to be fair. I don't know how the damn things work, but they're fascinating things. So the Daneway, this is where the Thames and Severn Canal reached its summit really, and a basin with lock gate was dug to help bring bricks and other construction materials for the construction of the Sapperton Tunnel. Once the tunnel was finished and opened, a sawmill and timber yard was created there for the nearby Bathurst estate, and also workers' cottages there were built. The Bricklayers Arms, which is now the Daneway pub, was originally built to house the managers and overseers of the navvies building the canal, and was named to celebrate the workers who were busy lining the canal with the bricks. So again, a nice little bit of history there. Moving on to the Thames Head. Because the Thames and Severn didn't have any reservoirs, it had to install pumps. So the first one was a wind pump near Kemble, which raised water from a well and dumped it into the summit level. And the idea being that it's just going to start then flowing down both ends of the canal as the locks were opened. This proved very inadequate, however. So in 1794, a Bolton and Watt Cornish beam steam engine was installed. This ran from June to October, which is the dry season, and it could pump 3 million gallons of water a day, but a lot of this was lost through leakage. In 1854, it was replaced by a newer engine, which ran nicely until 1912. It was then stopped, and the whole thing was removed in World War II for scrap metal. Today, nothing remains as the site, which is a shame, because it'd be lovely to have it there. So this is a lovely little letter. This is a letter from a manager at Brimscombe Port, written on the 25th of November 1842, and it heralds the beginning of the end for the Thames and Severn and the Stroud canals. In the middle of it there, it states, "Since my letter of the 23rd instant referred to the subject, to Mr. Lane, Mr. Brunel and the others have been seen going over the line of proposed railroad along this valley, which I consider as indicative of the report having some foundation." So basically, they knew at some point the railway was coming, and come it did. The Gloucestershire Railway from Gloucester to Swindon opened in 1845, and though the canal cut tolls to try and stay competitive, revenue fell from £11,000 in 1841 to just £2,800 in 1855. That's a massive drop. The Thames and Severn declined very, very rapidly, and in 1927 it was abandoned. The Stroud Water struggled on until it followed suit in 1941. So again, the Thames and Severn has left a huge archive, over 1,000 items, ledgers, journals, import and export books, tonnage books, cash books, workbooks, arrived at vessels works, London wharf accounts, dockage of vessels, loads of things, repair books. It's a fantastic archive. And again, we have a lovely sort of group of people going through this in the archives, making a full catalogue of it. Interestingly, in 1802, a chap called Richard Miller, who was a manager employed by the Thames and Severn in their Brimscombe office, he started his own business empire. And among them, he had a coal business, a carrying business on the canal, a coach business taking people to London, plus warehouses at Dudbridge, Brimscombe. And among other things, he also founded the Brimscombe Port Bank. And this is where this 1 guinea note was issued. And it must have been quite nice for a little while going along. You get your bank from there, bring money from there. But sadly, he did seem to have overstretched himself, and the bank was short-lived. And just 4 years later, it collapsed, taking with it most of his business ventures. But at least we've got this one piece of evidence that it did exist. So moving on, we come to Pigcott's Canal in Lydney. So this is a very short canal, less than 2 miles long. Goes back to 1775 when David Tanner of Tintern was granted a lease of the Upper Forge Ironworks north of Lydney. The lease he obtained included powers to dig canal from there via Middle Forge to the Lower Forge Ironworks, and then down to Lydney Pill. However, we know Tanner sold his lease in 1789 to members of the Pidcock family. These were glass masters from Staffordshire, and it seems that they built the canal. And you can see the canal here on this map on the right-hand side. You can see the sort of the wiggly river going through, but then you can see a straighter line. It's up the right-hand side at the Upper Forge and the Middle Forge, and it goes to the left-hand side from the Middle Forge to the Lower Forge there. Locally, it was known as the Cut. It had just 3 locks, all below Middle Forge, so we don't precisely know where they were. And following the construction of the Lydney Canal in 1813, it connected to that, not to Lydney Pill. It was apparently disused by 1840, but it can still be traced from Middle Forge downstream via St Mary's Halt in Lydney to just above Lydney Junction. So if you have a trip on the Dean Forest Railway, you're sort of paralleling its course in many respects. The Herefordshire and Gloucestershire Canal. First plan for a canal link in Hereford and Gloucester was made in 1777, but it wasn't until 1790 that promoters actually put it before Parliament. A chap called Joshua Clowes was appointed the engineer, and the first route went through Ledbury with a branch to Newent to access its small coalfields. But in 1792, an alteration was made, taking the canal directly to Newent. But this then required a tunnel at Oxenhall, and a new Act of Parliament approved this route in 1793. The canal ran for 34 miles from Hereford Basin through Ledbury, Dimmock, Newent to Over, where it locked out onto the west channel of the River Severn. And then a second cut took it across Alney Island to link to Gloucester. Very little of that second cut survives now, sadly. It must have been quite fascinating. Canal had 22 locks, 3 tunnels, and a short coal branch to Gorsley, say, to get to those coal fields. The tunnels were the Aylstone Tunnel, the Ashburton Tunnel, and the longer Oxenhall Tunnel. The latter especially was a difficult engineering project and proved very costly, and was responsible for the canal eventually not making any money at all, or very little, because it was just so expensive. However, one very notable bridge on the Hereford and Gloucestershire Canal is the Monkhide Skew Bridge. This is really odd because it was built to allow a minor no-through road to cross the canal. It was built by Stephen Bannard, the canal engineer, in 1843, and rather than divert the road, which we thought would have been more sensible, he built the bridge at an angle of 27 degrees to canal, making it the most skew canal bridge in Britain. And you can just see from the map and the picture there, you know, the complex engineering this required. It would have been much simpler just to divert the road, surely, but no, he built this bridge. It's constructed of red brick with stone dressing. The parapets are capped with large brick engineering works made by the B.W. Blades of West Bromwich, and it is a Grade 2 listed structure right in the middle of the countryside, miles from anywhere, basically. It's a wonderful bridge, it really is. So by 1795, the H&G Canal was open between Gloucester and Newent, but it wasn't until 1845 that it reached Hereford. Its cost had far exceeded estimates, so that actually almost immediately the canal company proposed to sell the canal and convert it to a railway, as by this time railway mania had now overtaken canal mania. Initially, This came to nothing, but in 1862, less than 17 years after its full opening, the canal was leased to the Great Western and West Midland Railway. Conversion didn't take place immediately, but in 1881, half the canal was closed. It was filled in, and large sections of it were used for the course of the Ledbury and Gloucester Railway. The canal company was continued to receive rent from the Great Western Railway, which it distributed to its shareholders as dividends, very poor ones. And the actual company was not formally wound up until the railways were nationalised in 1948. So an amazing lateness there. The railway, which is known as the Daffodil Line, lasted until 1964 when it too closed. And this is a couple of pictures of Barbara's Bridge station then and now, and the canal ran quite close to this station. Moving on to the Coombe Hill Canal near Cheltenham, excuse me. This opened in 1796, primarily to allow Staffordshire and Farstling coal to be moved as close as possible to the then rapidly expanding town of Cheltenham. Cost about £5,000, ran for just 2 3/4 miles from a lock on the Severn, which could accommodate quite large barges of 60-70 tons, and ran to Wainload Hill. Ran from just above Wainload Hill to Coombe Hill. The canal terminated at the basin at Coombe Hill, which is still there today, had warehouses and company headquarters there. The canal was actually owned by just 3 people, William Miller, Sarah Mumford and Thomas Burgess. They were the owners for much of its life. However, the main problem was that the canal stopped 5 miles short of Cheltenham. And this was basically thanks to a 100-foot high ridge of Triassic mudstone that required a flight of locks to pass over. And this would have proved very, very expensive, and essentially the canal company just couldn't afford it. Though plans were drawn up to extend it and also to install a horse tram road to Cheltenham, these came to nothing primarily because of the Gloucester and Cheltenham tram road opened in 1811, and henceforth lots of coal and stuff could actually come from Gloucester, where it's easy to unload, through to Cheltenham on the tram road. So the Coombe Hill Canal lost its main purpose, sadly. And despite the canal actually charging tolls as high as 2 shillings 6pence a tonne, it made very little or no profit whatsoever. So subsequently, it was leased to various concerns, most notably in 1849 to the Staffordshire and Worcestershire Canal. They gave up the lease in 1867, however, when cargo fell just 1,800 tonnes a year, which is nothing. The company then asked the engineer of the Gloucester and Sharpnester Canal to provide a report on it, and he suggested it's never going to be profitable, it's best to turn it into an oyster bed. They didn't actually follow that in the end, but it was sold twice more until it was abandoned under the very posh Coombe Hill Canal Navigation Abandonment Act of 1876. This happened when the new owners were unable to afford repairs to the lock after it had been damaged in some of the Severn's winter floods. In 1954, the canal in Fenland and flood meadow areas around it were designated as SSI's sites of special scientific interest, and in 2000, the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust adopted the site, turning it into a nature reserve, which it is today. And again, it's a really nice place to visit if you've not gone there. I thoroughly recommend it. But go there in summer or autumn or late spring. Don't go there in winter, because most of the time it's underwater. So the Cinderford Canal, no act to this one. This was a private canal, opened in about 1797 and used to provide coke and water to Cinderford Ironworks. Relatively nothing is known about it, but it ran for about 1 1/4 miles from a dam pool at Broadmoor South to Cinderford Ironworks, just 15 feet wide with no locks. This is a picture of the map from the East Dean map of 1856. It's difficult to enlarge this map, partly because the map itself is huge. It's the biggest map we have in the office, and it's very difficult out the strong rooms. It's very difficult to photograph, but you can see the blue sort of Broadmoor dam there at the top, and it's just vaguely make out where it ran to. Its main used to carry small barges which carried coke to the furnace. It also carried a water wheel that powered bellows. So arguably it wasn't a proper canal because it did have a lot of flowing water through it. We know obviously iron ore was brought into the furnace by pack mule from local mines, but before the railways were built. We know the furnace existed in 1795, wasn't a success, ceased production in about 1807, and we think the canal was abandoned at the same time, but there's not a huge amount of information on this one. We next come to the Lydney Canal. In 1810, the Severn and Wye Canal Company obtained an act authorised the building of a canal to the Severn at Nass Point, linking to a tramway that ran from the forest's interior. The mile-long canal opened in 1813. By 1825, the outer harbour seen here and the locks were added, and a north pier had been added as well. Coal lathing stays were built at the northern end of the canal, allowing Lydney to become a thriving coal port for Forster Dean coal. And some magnificent photos here of a boat being a little puffer being actually loaded with coal with the sort of the tilt on itself. At its height, Lydney exported over 265,000 tonnes of forest coal a year, so it's a very, very busy port. Today, it's supposed to be rejuvenating. There's a lot of work going on. Its future's probably is secure, but we're not 100% sure of that. But it's still quite a pleasant walk along the middle section. The Gloucester and Berkeley Canal. In 1793, a bunch of Midland industrialists, merchants and various citizens of Gloucester got an act of parliament to construct a ship canal from Gloucester to Berkeley, basically to bypass the very difficult and dangerous tidal river Severn below Gloucester. Financial problems and Napoleonic wars meant the canal took much longer to build than expected, and it wasn't completed until 1827, 33 years after its construction had started. And on that chart of the River Severn there, you can see the course of the canal below the Severn. 86 feet 6 inches wide, 18 feet deep. The canal could handle a craft of 600 tons, so they could be over 190 feet long. And for a time, it was the biggest canal in England. During the hiatus in construction, it caused because the company ran out of money, basically, it was decided to take the canal not to Berkeley, but to Sharpness, as it was judged that the former was a better place for an entrance from the River Severn. So the canal had a sea lock and small basin at Sharpness, which is still there today, but there was no cargo handling facilities here, so basically ships went on to Gloucester, where a second basin with warehouses and cranes was built to discharge cargo. And of course, this is what later became the famous Gloucester docks. Despite the change of destination, the company was also officially known as the Gloucester and Berkeley Canal Company until 1935, when it was finally renamed the Gloucester and Sharpness Canal Company. So by the late 1860s, the increasing size of ships made the original entrance at Sharpness too small. So a new floating harbour was built at a cost of £400,000. This opened in 1874. And again, a marvellous feat of engineering. You can't help but imagine how expensive this would be to make today. It'd be prohibitive. It'd be HS2 style costs. So it added an extra 17.5 acres of open water and had lots of advantages over the old basin. The entrance was a large tidal basin with a lock, which means the water level in the canal could be maintained quite happily. The entrance was below Sharpness Point, giving more craft room to manoeuvre as they entered the dock, and also the space around allowed new warehouses, and before long a large rail network grew up around the port to facilitate cargo handling around it. And this is a wonderful photograph of the port of Sharpness from the Coley.net website. This was taken by Fred Robotham. It's from his collection, and it just gives you an idea of the sheer size of the new basin and the old basin. On the left-hand side there, you can see the old basin. You can see the lock and the harbour master's cottage. But look in the middle, that sweep of the new basin, and absolutely huge. The sea lock itself, 320 foot long, 57 foot wide, and you can basically see some of the lines around there. So it is, Sharpness is still a working port today, although hopefully it will survive. It's not as busy as it once was, but fingers crossed it will. So looking at other sites on the Gloucester Sharpness Canal, one of the most important was the Slimbridge Wharf. So on World War I, storage obviously of explosives and propellants for munitions is nationally important. 2 new national storage sites were built, one at Skipton in Yorkshire, and the other was on Slimbridge on the estate of the Berkeleys. It was known as His Majesty's Magazine number 23, had 17 munition stores, 16 held 200 tons of cordite, 1 held 2,000 tons, and they're all served by a wharf on the Gloucester Sharpness Canal at Shepherd's Patch, seen here. It also boasted an internal rail network, an engine shed, guard barracks, and a rail link to the Bristol-Birmingham Railway, mainline railway. And that's a little plan of it, with the canal there in the top left, as you can see. Post-war, the site was used to dispose of cordite by burning. You can burn cordite quite happily; it doesn't go bang. And when it was handed, interesting, when it was handed back to the Barclays in 1924, they stipulated that every structure where a fox could hide was to be removed, so the animals were less able to avoid the hunt. Isn't that nice? Frampton-on-Severn, Cadbury's Wharf, 1915. The Cadbury brothers, who loved using canals, they loved the canal network. They acquired land under the DORA, the Defence of the Realm Act, to build a milk processing factory and a wharf at Frampton. Opened in April 16, and milk from the Vale of Gloucester was brought into the factory, where it's pasteurised, then mixed up with cocoa beans and sugar, brought up in barges from Bristol to make the famous chocolate crumb. The crumb was then transported onwards to Gloucester, then via the River Severn and the Staffordshire and Worcester Canal to Cadbury's Bourneville in Birmingham. By 1917, as well as chocolate, the site was making condensed milk and cheese. And by 1918, it was also supplying pasteurised milk to Birmingham as well. So it was quite an important site. And it remained open until 1982, until it closed. Moving on, you get nearer Gloucester, we get to Monk Meadow Dock, and this was home to the Shellmex BP Quenchley Tank Farm. Built in 1941-42 as a part of the GPSS, the Government Pipelines and Storage System, and it was known as the Gloucester AFD, Aviation Fuel Depot. It received fuel by road, rail, but mostly by tanker barge, and there's a lot of history of this in Gloucester. By 1959, it's transferred from the Air Ministry to the Ministry of Power, and then to Texaco in 1971, but it was still owned by the government. However, it closed in the early 1990s after the end of the Cold War. It was disconnected from the still strategically important GPSS, which interestingly was sold off to Spain in 2012 by the Conservative government. So again, a national asset being sold off to somebody else. You know, we're probably never going to fight a war with Spain, but they might nick Gibraltar one day. You know, they could turn the pump pipeline off. Look at Severn Trows. Basically, I mentioned these were locally evolved crafts suited to work in the tidal River Severn. They had 4.5 sails. These point along the boat rather than across it, so they make it easier to handle. Plus, they're a deep, broad hull, usually around 70 feet long and 15 foot wide. Often termed wide barges that could carry on the order of 50 to 60 tons cargo. And there's a lovely picture of the Monarch at Tewkesbury, again from the Fred Robotham collection on Coley.net. And also a picture of the Reliance with a mast down at Pike Lock. So narrow barges, known as stride barges, had a similar sail rig, but they're only up to 12 foot wide, so they could pass through the narrow locks of the Thames and Severn. And then we get the narrow boats, open hold, small cabin, stern and flat bottom, came into use after the opening of the Gloucestershire and Ness Canal in 1827. And these were just 7 foot wide to suit the narrow locks of the Midland canals. And again, a couple of lovely pictures here. This is what a narrow boat passing Brimscombe, heading towards Brimscombe Port. You can just make out the horse on the right-hand side. As steam and diesel power progressively replaced these, basically you would often have a motorboat, then tower and a second unpowered boat, which is usually preferred as a butty or a butty boat. Cargoes, the most common cargo on the county canals was coal, and this is a lovely photograph, wonderfully atmospheric. It's the scene at the canal wharf at Cirencester. And you can see it's basically all hands to the pumps to unload local coal merchant Frank Gegg & Co.'s wagons, unloading coal from the barge staunts. And I think it's a lovely photograph. I don't know where this one came from. We have it, but it's got no reference in it. So if you do own it, apologies. Hope you don't mind us using it. We'll happily credit you in the future. So coal was in high demand by the various mills in Stroud. Although most initially came from Staffordshire or Shropshire, it was later placed by coal from South Gloucestershire and the Forest of Dean. And then there's a lovely little picture. This is the barge Alert being unloaded, hand unloaded this time by the narrowboat crew. And you can see they're carrying like a hod of coal here on a stretcher. Again, a lovely picture. And again, one of the bonuses here was basically you had cheaper coal in Stroud, and there's got a couple of postcard prices from the basic Stroud Journal. You've got a letterhead of James Smart, very important local haulier, and this is a page from the Severn Stroud Water Canal, Kennage book. Origins of the coal carrier. It's difficult to make out there, but it's got Tenby, Shropshire, Staffordshire, and the Forest. So it was taking in a lot of coal. Other bar cargoes, grain, timber, stone and hay. And this is a quick picture of the Gem loading and unloading a cargo of stone at Brimscombe Port. We don't know which. The Canal Boat Register, so in 1795, an act ordered that all vessels using navigable rivers and canals had to be registered with the quarter sessions. This is the entry for the barge Recovery, owner and master Richard Saunders, and this plied between Brimscombe, Lechlade and London. The act came about because of the threat of invasion in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and essentially the government realised there was a need to be able to transport troops rapidly across the country, but no one knew how to do this, and obvious canals were a good way of doing it, but nobody knew how many canal craft there were. So this act allowed them to actually get a register and a census of these so they could all be requisitioned if needed. And we've got quite a few of these, just as another couple here. There'll be some out on display on our open day on the December float event. So quick look at living on board. Though some watermen's families lived in towns, many lived on the boats. Most of the, especially the narrow boats, had a similar arrangement. Very, very compact. Very compact space. All space was used. These could be wonderfully rich and complex, or squalid, depending on sort of the wife of the boat, basically. So a lot of really interesting work goes on in these. Overcrowding could be a problem. A boat might be home for a man, wife and their children, and as many as 10 children have been recorded living on one of these boats, so they can be very crowded. Some boats had a tiny unheated cratch cabin. This is at the very front of the boat where a couple of children could sleep, although most families slept in the main cabin. Of course, on board, the wife had to do all the cooking, laundering and washing up, usually on the cabin roof. And of course, there was no running water and no sanitation. The towpath was used in the most convenient toilet that was used. And last but not least, of course, women typically gave birth on board. And even as late as 1920, a government report indicated that 50% of the boat children had been born on the narrowboat that was their home. This really the Canal Boat Act of 1877 was brought in to try and improve living conditions on the canals. Basically, Victoria concerned about cramped space, poor living, but also the moral welfare of women and girls in their sleeping arrangements. Aim was to improve conditions by specifying the number of adults and children that could live aboard a canal boat, and it also tried to bring the children into the education system, because it realised that very often few of them were. So henceforth, all canal boats used as dwellings had to be registered with the local authority, pass an inspection, after which they would get a certificate. And we'll say we're lucky enough to have the survival of these from Gloucester Borough, and they're really interesting reading. And again, some of these will be on display at our event in December. So by the 1930s, only the Gloucester Sharpness Canal was still in use. The others had been abandoned and were rapidly falling into disrepair. But as I mentioned at the very start today, there's a massive revival in canals, thank the Lord, and work by the Cotswold Canals Trust, who are doing the Stroudwater and the Thames and Severn, the Herefordshire and Gloucestershire Canal Trust, and the Lydney Dock Partnership are starting to restore these canals. Or as I've mentioned, the Coombe Hill Canal is a valuable nature reserve. So thank goodness that all these canals are now beginning to return to life. It's a fantastic one. And I'll sort of draw the talk to the close with a couple of little fun quiz for you. Here's a little question for you. What's the Gloucestershire connection with C.S. Forester's 1953 novel Hornblower and the Atropos? There we go. I will give you the answer. It's because Hornblower travels through the Sapperton Tunnel on a narrowboat. Our hero, with his pregnant wife Maria, his first wife, and their son, travel to London via Thames and Severn Canal. And on the canal, he helps leg the boat through the Sapperton Tunnel, and then volunteers as a helmsman after the assistant boatman becomes incapacitated through drunk. Basically, lets him learn about canal life. So it's a great story, and it's great that Gloucestershire's Sapperton Tunnel made it into it. So that's the end of the talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. By necessity, we've had to try and cram a lot in. But obviously, here's our usual plug for our event, our next event at the Heritage Hub, the Float event. All-day focus on canals. Talks by Tony Conda on an introduction to Gloucestershire's canals, and Martin Bryant on the Stroudwater Canal. We also have creative canals. It's going to be a session of drama and art inspired by local canals, led by John Bassett and some younger teenagers. That'll be fun. We've also got heritage stands, the Canal and Rivers Trust, the Cotswold Canals Trust, the Stroudwater Navigation Archive Charity, the Herefordshire and Gloucestershire Canal Trust. We've also got a Guess the Canal Object quiz. That's going to be great fun. And also a display from the Gloucester District Model Boat Club. We've also got a demonstration of the Stroud Navigation Charity's award-winning website. So that one I mentioned earlier, it'll be here on the day, so do come and see it. We'll also have display of archive records of canals, free refreshments on the day. And of course, the Gloucestershire Family History Society are going to be on hand to find out whether your ancestors were watermen, bargees, or possibly pirates. And a little final plug here. So Secrets Revealed will be taking a break over Christmas. Nobody wants to hear me gab along on the 25th of December. So we'll be back on the 22nd of January 2025 with the talk being titled Here Be Dragons, a look at Gloucestershire's maps. And on that note, Gemma, back over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, John. That was absolutely fascinating. I feel like I've learned a huge amount as always. Just a few questions. First of all, we had one question about whether this recording will be available to you. Just to let you know that all of the Secrets Revealed talks are recorded and then they are put up on our Secrets Revealed YouTube channel. If you want to ever search for any of them, just put in Secrets Revealed and you'll find them all listed there. And Katie, who does our tech, also wants to just remind you that the link for this particular talk will be sent to you when it goes up on YouTube. We've also got Emma Neve, who has a few questions. A couple of them I can help with, but the first one, John, I think might be for you. So Emma says a good number of her relatives lived at the back of the Avon in Tewkesbury and are listed as watermen on the censuses. Later, some are coal merchants. She's often wondered where they would have been taking their boats from and to, please. Would it be down towards Bristol or up to Birmingham or across to Staffordshire even? Is that something you know anything about,
It
John?
would probably be a mix of all three, I suspect. We certainly know that the seven trows that called at Tewkesbury went on down to Bristol, but a lot of the barges went upriver as well, so they would probably work anywhere. I suspect slightly fewer went down to the Thames across through the Stroudwater and the Thames and Severn. But I mean, a look at the records of that would reveal whether the boats coming from Tewkesbury did that. I think that would be something that the Stroudwater Navigation Archive charity could help with as well. So possibly, I would say, not as many there, but they're definitely going up and down the rivers on the Avon as well, sort of thing. So definitely going up into the Midlands and down to Bristol.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, John. Emma has also asked about a couple of questions about finding out about relatives who worked in and around the canals. What I'd say probably to you, Emma, and I don't know if John wants to chip in on this, is when it comes to sort of finding out about relatives, obviously without looking at our records, I couldn't tell you whether we have information or not. And some of it, because it's not like a library, unfortunately, you can't sort of take things out. It would be a matter of you having a look at our online catalogue, which I have listed below, seeing try putting family members, things like that into that catalogue, see what we've got. It might be a matter of coming in and just flicking through different records, trying to find what you're looking for. If you are stuck with that, I've also given you the email. You can email in, and you can also organise a one-to-one with myself or John. We could sit down with you and help you to search. We can't obviously promise there'll be things, but we can certainly help you with that. And finally, the Family History Centre for Gloucestershire is also under the same roof as us. And I would say that I can see you've looked at censuses, but it might be also worth popping in and speaking to them. They do have other resources beyond censuses, but also they're very good. The volunteers who run it are excellent, and they're very good at sort of getting past difficulties if you're struggling with that. John, anything you want to?
Yeah, I would say, just as you said, there are also some quite good books on researching the history of waterman families. But the Gloucestershire Family History Society, they will do sort of modest research for you. But on the other hand, they cost about £10 a year to join. So once you join, they will, you've got access to all their records and all their advice. And if you think your waterman family are sort of down here, that's great. There is also a fabulous new project just starting called the Gloucestershire Mariners Project, and this is partly what it aims to pull together as much information on the waterman families in the whole of the county to bring it together. So there's a lot of work going on this at the moment. Keep your eyes peeled. It will be promoted. There'll be a website and all sorts of things. It's going to be a wonderful project. We're getting involved. It's led by Tony Condor, and it's partly to help with the celebrations of next year's Gloucester docks, the centenaries for that. So that is one. But I would say thoroughly recommend have a chat with the local family history society, or even if I said you noticed you said you don't live local, have a word with your local family history society. I'm sure there's people there if you have the same sort of issues.
Yes, and Emma, just to say that a lot of the online resources that are free at our Family History Centre are also free at any local library. So you should be able to go in and do that. And beyond that, you could hire an independent researcher. We do have a list of them on our website. They can come in and do research for you if you do find some kind of. You can still look at the online catalogue and see what there is, and if you think there's anything promising there, that might be something you might want to consider. And finally, Emma also asked what the Tewkesbury boats would have looked like for coal merchants. Any idea, John?
They would probably be either, if there could be narrow boats. There's also the trows, the barge trows. There is a very nice picture. It used to be hanging in the Tewkesbury Borough Council's council chamber of the sort of the dock at Tewkesbury, or the port at Tewkesbury, and there are some rather nice looking barges on there. They're probably a variant of the Severn Trow. Definitely they're that sort of size vessel. But yeah, put Tewkesbury Borough Council, Tewkesbury Wharf or Tewkesbury Dock in. You should get a good picture on that. There's also some good books in your local library. So there's History of the Severn Trows, published by Lightmoor Press. That's a very good one. And there's James Smart of Chalford, again published by Chalford Press. That's a good one as well. But they're probably more sort of sailing barges at Tewkesbury, because Tewkesbury they could sail quite happily on the river and down the canal to Gloucester, and then on down to Bristol Channel, etc.
Brilliant, thanks, John. And I have put in the contact for Tewkesbury Local History Society as well, and they're very good at sort of they've got lots of information sort of squirreled away, and also even if you are quite far away. You'll find that a lot of these local history groups do have online presences, whether it's a group on Facebook or something like that. So I'd say it's worth getting in contact with them too. So, okay. I hope that all helped. Lots of thanks to you, John, for giving such a fantastic talk. And I think we'll wrap it up there. But if anyone does have any questions, as always, please do email into us at the archives. Okay, thanks very much, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Cheerio.
Bye.
That must be me.